Pain does not begin when it finally hurts. It begins quietly years earlier, while the body is still moving and life feels normal. Long before discomfort appears, tissues are adapting, nerves are learning, and inflammation is slowly settling in as a background process. The body compensates with patience, redistributing stress and protecting vulnerable areas without asking for attention. Pain arrives only when this silent negotiation can no longer continue, not as a sudden failure, but as the body's delayed message that something has been changing all along. Pain is often misunderstood as a sudden event, something that appears out of nowhere, as the result of a single mistake, a wrong movement, or an isolated injury. But biologically, it is rarely that simple. In most cases, pain is the final expression of a process that has been unfolding quietly for years, shaped by how the body adapts to repeated demands placed upon it. The human body is designed to be remarkably tolerant. It absorbs stress, compensates for weakness, and redistributes load with incredible intelligence, all while keeping us functional and unaware that anything is changing beneath the surface. Every day, tissues respond to the forces they experience. Muscles shorten or lengthen, depending on how often they are used. Joints remodel themselves, based on the angles and loads they repeatedly encounter. Connective tissue thickens in areas where stability is prioritized over mobility. None of this is harmful by default. In fact, it is how the body survives. But when these adaptations are driven by imbalance rather than variety, they slowly move the system away from resilience. The body does not warn us loudly when this begins. It simply adjusts, quietly choosing efficiency over range, protection over freedom. At the cellular level, this process is subtle but relentless. Small amounts of inflammation appear not as an emergency response, but as a low-grade signal that tissue is under repeated strain. Blood flow patterns shift. Repair mechanisms become less efficient. Cells prioritize survival rather than optimal function. Because these changes happen gradually, the brain categorizes them as normal. There is no sharp alarm, no moment where pain demands attention. Life continues uninterrupted, reinforcing the illusion that nothing is wrong. The nervous system plays a central role in this long adaptation. It constantly gathers information from the body, learning which areas are stressed and which movements feel safe. When a joint or muscle is exposed to repeated strain, the nervous system increases vigilance there. Not through pain at first, but through subtle tension, reduced movement confidence, or mild stiffness that disappears once warmed up. These sensations are easy to ignore, especially in a culture that celebrates pushing through discomfort. Over time, the nervous system learns to expect threat in certain patterns, gradually lowering the threshold at which signals are interpreted as danger. This is why pain often feels disproportionate when it finally arrives. It is not responding to the present moment alone, but to a long memory of accumulated stress. The nervous system is not reacting to a single event, but 2 years of data. What feels sudden to the mind is actually delayed to the body. Pain appears only when the cost of continued compensation becomes too high, when tissues can no longer absorb load without signaling distress. One of the most deceptive aspects of this process is that strength and performance can coexist with declining tissue health. A person may be active, productive, and seemingly strong while underlying systems are slowly losing adaptability. Movement becomes efficient but less flexible. Patterns become predictable. The body relies on the same muscles and joints to do most of the work, while others quietly disengage. This creates pockets of overload that are masked by overall functionality, allowing the adaptation to continue unchecked. Psychological stress weaves itself into this story as well. Chronic stress alters hormonal balance, increases baseline inflammation, and reduces the body's capacity to repair. It also narrows attention, making subtle bodily signals easier to dismiss. The body does not separate physical strain from emotional strain. Both are processed through the same adaptive systems. Over time, this amplifies the quiet changes already taking place, accelerating the path toward pain without ever producing a clear warning sign. Pain, then, is not the beginning of damage, but the moment awareness is forced. It is the body's last available language after quieter signals have been ignored or normalized. By the time pain is felt, tissues have already changed, neural pathways have already adapted, and compensation has already become the default strategy. This does not mean the body is broken. It means it has been working too hard, for too long, without being given the conditions it needs to recover and adapt in healthier directions. Understanding pain as a long-term biological adaptation rather than a sudden failure shifts how we respond to it. It invites patience instead of panic, curiosity instead of blame. It reminds us that the body is not fragile or unpredictable, but consistent and deeply logical. It adapts faithfully to what it experiences most often, whether those experiences are nourishing or limiting, varied or repetitive, supportive or demanding, shaping pain not as an accident, but as a reflection of time, habit, and the quiet intelligence of survival mechanisms doing their best under imperfect conditions. Low-level inflammation and repeated stress rarely announce themselves with pain in the beginning. They operate beneath awareness, woven into daily life so subtly that they feel indistinguishable from normal aging or ordinary fatigue. Inflammation, in its healthy form, is a powerful tool for repair. It rushes resources to injured tissue, clears debris, and initiates healing. The problem begins when this process never fully turns off. Instead of short, purposeful bursts, inflammation becomes a constant background state, quietly altering the environment in which cells live and function. Repeated stress is often mechanical at first. The same joints move through the same ranges. The same muscles carry the same loads, and the same postures are held for hours at a time. Each repetition on its own is harmless. But biology does not count events the way the mind does. It counts exposure. Over time, tissues begin to experience microstrain that is too small to injure but too frequent to fully recover from. The body responds by reinforcing those areas, thickening connective tissue, and slightly altering movement patterns to distribute force more efficiently. These changes reduce immediate risk, but they also reduce adaptability. As low-grade inflammation settles in, the chemistry of tissue slowly shifts. Cells become less efficient at exchanging nutrients and waste. Blood vessels lose some of their responsiveness. Repair processes slow. Not because the body is failing, but because it is conserving energy for what it perceives as a persistent challenge. This state does not hurt. It simply feels like stiffness in the morning, or the need to warm up longer, or a vague sense that movement is less fluid than it once was. These sensations are easy to dismiss because they fade quickly and do not interrupt daily function. The nervous system adapts alongside these physical changes. When inflammation is present, even at low levels, nerve endings become more responsive. They begin to amplify signals from the affected tissues, not to create pain, but to increase awareness. This heightened sensitivity is subtle. It may show up as a preference to avoid certain movements, or as tension that appears automatically in specific areas. Because these responses are protective, the brain interprets them as helpful. They become habits rather than warnings. Repeated stress also affects how muscles coordinate. Some muscles gradually take on more work because they are always available, while others become inhibited due to reduced use or altered neural signaling. This imbalance increases load on specific structures, which in turn sustains inflammation in those areas. The cycle feeds itself quietly. The body remains functional, but efficiency replaces balance, and protection replaces freedom. The system is no longer adapting toward health, but toward endurance. Lifestyle factors deepen this process. Poor sleep limits the body's ability to resolve inflammation. Chronic psychological stress elevates inflammatory signals throughout the system. Diets high in processed foods or low in essential nutrients further impair repair. None of these factors cause immediate pain on their own. Instead, they create an internal environment where recovery is always incomplete. Tissues exist in a state of perpetual low-level repair, never fully damaged, but never fully restored. Over months and years, this environment reshapes tissue structure. Fascia becomes denser and less elastic. Cartilage loses some of its capacity to distribute load smoothly. Muscles lose fine control at their end ranges. These changes are adaptive, not degenerative in intent. They are the body's attempt to maintain stability in the face of constant demand. Pain remains absent because the system is still managing to cope. Eventually, however, the margin for adaptation narrows. A small increase in stress, a minor injury, or even an emotional shock can overwhelm the system's reduced capacity. At this point, inflammation spikes, nerve sensitivity increases sharply, and pain finally emerges. To the person experiencing it, pain feels sudden and unexplained. In reality, it is the tipping point of a process that has been unfolding for years. Understanding this quiet progression changes how we interpret discomfort. It reveals that pain is not simply about damaged tissue, but about an environment that has been under sustained strain. It highlights the importance of recovery, variation, and attention long before pain appears. The body does not fail abruptly. It adapts faithfully to repeated stress and unresolved inflammation until adaptation itself becomes the source of suffering, revealing pain not as a mystery, but as a delayed signal from a system that has been carrying more than it was designed to bear for far too long. The nervous system learns through repetition long before it learns through pain. Its primary role is not to generate discomfort, but to predict and protect. Every movement, posture, and sensation is recorded as data, shaping expectations about what is safe and what might pose a threat. When certain tissues are exposed to repeated strain, even if that strain is mild, the nervous system begins to pay closer attention. At first, this attention is subtle. It may appear as increased muscle tone, a feeling of tightness, or a slight hesitation before moving into certain positions. These are not symptoms of injury, but signs of learning. Over time, the nervous system becomes more efficient at anticipating stress. It does not wait for damage to occur. Instead, it adjusts sensitivity to minimize risk. Nerves supplying frequently stressed areas become more responsive, firing signals more easily. The brain interprets this increased input not as pain, but as information. It may encourage protective behaviors such as limiting range of motion, altering posture, or recruiting additional muscles to stabilize an area. These adaptations feel automatic and sensible, reinforcing the idea that the body is functioning well. The gradual lowering of pain thresholds begins here. Pain is not a fixed signal tied to a specific level of tissue damage. It is a decision made by the nervous system based on context, history, and perceived threat. When an area has been under low-level stress for a long time, the nervous system begins to treat even neutral sensations as potentially important. The volume knob is turned up slowly. What once required strong input to be noticed now registers with minimal stimulation. This shift happens so gradually that it escapes conscious awareness. One of the most important factors in this process is predictability. Repetitive movements and static postures create patterns that the nervous system becomes highly familiar with. Familiarity does not always mean safety. When stress is predictable and unchanging, the nervous system learns that the load will continue indefinitely. In response, it becomes more vigilant. This vigilance is not experienced as fear, but as control. Muscles tighten earlier. Movement options narrow. The system prioritizes stability over exploration, reducing variability to minimize perceived risk. As sensitivity increases, the distinction between sensation and pain begins to blur. Signals that were once interpreted as pressure, stretch, or effort may start to carry emotional weight. The nervous system integrates sensory input with memory and expectation. Past experiences of discomfort, stress, or injury influence how current signals are evaluated. Even without conscious recall, the brain remembers patterns associated with threat. This memory shapes perception, making certain sensations feel unpleasant long before tissue damage is present. This process explains why pain can persist even when scans show minimal structural change. The nervous system is not responding to anatomy alone. It is responding to probability. It calculates the likelihood that continued stress will lead to harm and adjusts output accordingly. When sensitivity has been elevated for a long time, pain becomes easier to trigger and harder to turn off. The system has learned that vigilance is necessary. Importantly, this learning is reversible, but only when the nervous system is given new information. Variety, safety, and gradual exposure are essential. Without them, the system continues to rely on old predictions. Rest alone is often insufficient because it does not challenge the learned associations. The nervous system needs evidence that movement can be safe again, that load can be tolerated, and that sensations do not always signal danger. The quiet nature of this learning process is what makes pain feel confusing when it finally appears. There is no single moment to blame, no clear injury to point to. Pain emerges as the accumulated expression of thousands of small decisions made by the nervous system over time. It reflects adaptation, not weakness. It reveals how deeply the body values survival and how carefully it monitors the world beneath conscious awareness. When pain is understood as learned sensitivity rather than sudden failure, it invites a different response. Instead of fighting the body, it becomes possible to work with it, to rebuild trust, to reintroduce movement as information rather than threat. The nervous system is always listening, always updating its predictions. When given consistent signals of safety and capacity, it can raise thresholds again, quieting pain not by force, but by learning that protection is no longer required. The body has an extraordinary ability to compensate long before it ever complains. When one structure begins to struggle, another quietly steps in to help. When a joint loses a small degree of mobility, nearby tissues increase their workload. When a muscle weakens or becomes inhibited, others tighten and take over. These adjustments happen automatically, without conscious input, guided by the nervous system's priority to keep us moving and functional. At first, this is a strength. Compensation allows us to continue living normally despite imbalance, fatigue, or incomplete recovery. This process works because the body values continuity over perfection. It would rather move imperfectly than not move at all. Each compensation is a small negotiation, a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. The body spreads stress across available structures, redistributing load so that no single area fails too quickly. As long as there is reserve capacity, this strategy works beautifully. Pain remains absent because the system is still coping. Over time, however, compensation begins to concentrate stress rather than relieve it. The tissues that take on extra work were not designed to carry it indefinitely. Muscles that stabilize become stiff and overactive. Joints that move well begin to move too much. Other joints become rigid, not because they are damaged, but because the system no longer trusts them to participate. These changes are subtle and adaptive, but they slowly erode balance within the system. What makes this phase so deceptive is that outward performance can remain high. A person can feel capable, productive, even strong, while underlying resilience is quietly shrinking. Movement patterns become efficient but narrow. The same strategies are used repeatedly because they work, not because they are ideal. The body chooses reliability over variety, reinforcing habits that feel stable in the short term but costly in the long term. As compensation deepens, recovery becomes less complete. Tissues are asked to perform without sufficient rest or variation. Micro repair lags behind demand. Inflammation lingers slightly longer after each stress. None of this is enough to trigger pain on its own. The system simply adjusts again, tightening here, unloading there, maintaining the illusion of normal function. Eventually, the margin for error disappears. The body reaches a point where every available strategy is already in use. There are no fresh tissues left to take on extra load, no new movement options to distribute stress. At this stage, even small challenges feel heavy. A minor change in routine, a slightly longer day, an awkward movement, or emotional strain can push the system beyond its capacity to compensate. Pain emerges at this moment, not because the stress is unprecedented, but because the system has run out of options. It is not the first sign of a problem, but the sign that adaptation has reached its limit. The body is no longer able to negotiate quietly. Pain becomes the only remaining tool to force change, to slow movement, to demand attention. This is why pain often feels confusing and unfair. It appears to come from nowhere, disconnected from effort or injury. In reality, it reflects a long history of successful compensation. The body did not fail suddenly. It succeeded for a very long time. Pain is the cost of that success when it is prolonged without restoration. Understanding this reframes pain as a signal of overload rather than damage. It highlights the importance of resilience, not just strength. It reminds us that the body needs variation, rest, and conscious care to replenish its capacity to adapt. When pain appears, it is not announcing collapse. It is revealing that the system has been working at the edge of its limits for too long, asking not for blame or fear, but for space to recover and reorganize before compensation hardens into chronic suffering. Pain is not an accident that interrupts life without meaning. It is a message shaped by everything the body has experienced, stored, adapted to, and endured over time. Every habit leaves a trace, every posture repeated, every movement avoided, every stress carried without release becomes part of the body's internal record. Pain speaks from this record. It is not reacting only to what is happening now, but to what has been happening for years, sometimes decades, beneath conscious awareness. The body remembers through structure and sensation. Muscles remember how often they are asked to work and how often they are allowed to rest. Joints remember the ranges they are trusted to move through and the ones they are denied. Connective tissue remembers whether movement is fluid or guarded. The nervous system remembers which sensations were ignored, which were pushed through, and which were associated with urgency or fear. Pain emerges from this memory, carrying information about patterns, not isolated events. Habits play a powerful role in shaping this message. The body adapts faithfully to what it does most often. If movement is limited, tissues become efficient within narrow ranges. If stress is constant, the nervous system maintains a state of alertness. If recovery is rushed or postponed, repair becomes incomplete. None of these habits feel dangerous in the moment. They feel practical, even necessary. Over time, however, they accumulate into a physiological narrative that pain eventually translates into sensation. Pain is also influenced by healing capacity, not just exposure to stress. Two bodies can experience similar demands and respond very differently, depending on sleep quality, nutrition, emotional support, and overall health. Healing is not a single process, but a collection of systems working together. When these systems are well supported, the body absorbs stress and returns to balance quietly. When support is lacking, adaptation becomes survival-focused rather than restorative. Pain reflects this imbalance, signaling not only that something hurts, but that recovery has fallen behind demand. History matters deeply in how pain is perceived. Past injuries, even those long resolved, shape neural pathways and expectations. The nervous system does not forget experiences associated with threat. It uses them to predict future risk. This does not mean pain is imagined. It means pain is informed. The body is constantly asking whether the present moment resembles past situations that required protection. When similarities appear, pain may surface as a precaution rather than a response to damage. Emotional experience is woven into this process as well. The body does not separate physical and emotional stress. Both are processed through shared systems that regulate tension, inflammation, and vigilance. Long periods of emotional strain can sensitize the nervous system, lowering tolerance for physical load. Pain then becomes a composite message, reflecting not only mechanical stress, but the overall burden the system has been carrying. This understanding challenges the idea that pain must always be eliminated quickly. Sometimes, pain is asking to be understood before it can be resolved. It is pointing toward patterns that need attention, rhythms that need slowing, and capacities that need rebuilding. Ignoring the message or silencing it without addressing its roots often leads to repetition, as the body finds new ways to speak when the first message goes unheard. Pain does not mean the body has failed. It means the body has been listening carefully and responding consistently to its environment. It has adapted to what it was given. When pain appears, it reveals the cost of those adaptations and invites a different conversation, one grounded in patience, curiosity, and respect for the body's intelligence. Seen this way, pain becomes less of an enemy and more of a translator. It turns invisible history into felt experience. It brings long-term patterns into the present moment where they can finally be addressed. It asks not for fear or frustration, but for understanding, reminding us that the body is not breaking down randomly, but expressing the truth of how it has been lived in, cared for, and asked to endure over time.